Workplace Pride, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the seventh in our series of webinars in our Keeping Members Connected series. So this is really a very interesting webinar this time in particular with the title of There's Always a Rainbow in the Cloud. Now this webinar is being presented by our program Tech at Workplace Pride. We've had previous webinars from Women at Workplace Pride and Young at Workplace Pride, but this is a very topical issue right now, particularly with the pandemic that we're all going through and the effects of the digital world around us. So I'm very happy to present right now Danny Belitz. Danny is a data scientist at the IBM Client Innovation Center in the Benelux. But before Danny comes on, I want to mention, of course, that you can always send in your questions via the chat function, and there will be a moment or actually quite a few moments at the end of the webinar for your questions. So Danny, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, David. So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. Good afternoon, good morning, and maybe even good evening to everyone. As David introduced me already, I'm Danny Belitz, and working as a data scientist for the IBM Client Innovation Center Benelux, and I'm based in Groningen. Personally, I am very passionate about data and artificial intelligence, and especially AI ethics. And today's presentation will actually cover some very related and very highly interesting topics that are also relevant to discussions about AI ethics. But before introducing our speaker for today, I just want to give you some background information first. I am part of Tech at Workplace Pride, and that is why I'm giving you this introduction today. As part of Tech at Workplace Pride, we are currently planning an event for later this year, on the 13th of November. So please save the date. And that event will all be around data. If you just take a moment to reflect now, in these trying times, working from home, all the information that you get comes to your screens and to your speakers. But what you might not think about is how many people are actually working in the background to make that happen, and what is actually happening with all that data. The Groningen region is one of the major players to actually make that happen. We have a lot of different tech companies located here in Groningen. And on the 13th of November, different companies will present about what they are doing in their companies, in their organizations, to keep this data-driven world spinning. And the name of the event is There's Always a Rainbow in the Cloud. During that event, we will talk about how data is collected, how you can protect data, and how different companies are using data. And of course, how does it actually relate to the LGBT plus community. Today's webinar will act as a teaser for this event, to already give you a small taste. And our speaker today, Willeke Slingerland, will also speak in Groningen in November. Today, Willeke, Professor of Applied Research for Resilient Democracy at the Saxion University of Applied Sciences, will investigate the question how resilient democracies should ensure that the collection of data to respond to COVID-19 is not posing a threat to the LGBT plus community. She will present for about 30 minutes, and afterwards we will have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please just put them in the chat box, and we will answer them later. And now, without further ado, I want to give the floor to Willeke.
So, good day to all of you. Thank you, David and Danny, for the great introduction. Indeed, I'm pleased, as on behalf of Saxion University of Applied Sciences, to bring you sort of a teaser today for the great event which is planned for this November. As Saxion, we are a member also of the WorkplacePride community and Tech at Workplace Pride. And of course, we think a lot about what should we actually do with this major topic of data, especially in times of pandemic. And we hope that even our students now are working on it, thinking about the ethical dimensions in the difficult decision-making, which is now going on and which is ahead of us. And I'm very pleased to work with the title, There's Always a Rainbow in the Cloud. The rainbow is a sign of hope, but also, of course, a sign of pride. in times of distress, in times of uncertainty, in poor times, and of course also in the sense that it's related to the way we now work in a digital society. So that's a very positive connotation which I would like to start with. So I'm very pleased that all of you are participating today. I would love to see all of you, your faces and where you're from, but hopefully we have some time during the interactive part of today's webinar to hear more about your experience, your ideas, and the questions you might have. So I try to keep my presentation short so that there's enough time for, well, hearing from your side and your ideas. When I have a legal background, and what I've seen so far is that privacy and data often have a very limited interpretation. So what I hope to do today is talk with you about the broader scope of privacy in the digital society, and in particular what it means for the LGBT plus community. Well, first of all, the technology which we will deal with today, and which Danny already exposed to some extent, I mean, it's very important that we all realize that it also has had a positive effect on the major topic of diversity and inclusion. Now we are able to connect beyond geographic and physical boundaries. There are all sort of dating apps available. We can meet online, and nobody should feel isolated because there's so much to connect with and so many people to connect with. And of course, advocacy and enabling campaigns for, well, LGBT rights and the LGBT plus agenda. So I think overall we feel that it's a positive situation which actually has lesser limitations. But of course, there's always, to every good side, there's also a downside. And I'm particularly worried with the situation right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, we've been dealing with it for some months now, and in total lockdown situations, intelligent lockdown situations, and trying to get more or less back to the normal life. But the normal life will mean that we as a country, we as the EU, we as a global world are thinking about how to use technology to isolate the virus. So there are, of course, examples from Asia where the COVID-19 virus actually was first occurred. We see that data is being used, new technology is being used, traffic technology, logistic technology, to actually screen with whom a person has been in touch with. And actually the contact research has also brought into question the privacy, the question again. And like I mentioned, I have a legal background, and until a couple of years ago, it was quite easy to say whether a certain instrument or tool was actually meeting privacy standards. Well, with the renewed situation of the COVID-19 and with the, cry out for health and security issues, you do see a reflex, which makes sense from a psychology point of view, to make more technology available and to use technology in the best way to make sure that lockdown situations are prevented, that we isolate cases of who is actually, a carrier of the COVID virus, and try to isolate within the countries. But having said that, there are concerns in terms of privacy, and specifically for the LGBT plus community. And some of the headlines which I've put down here show how far-reaching effects such technology and data can have. We've seen an example of Seoul, where actually South Korea has been very good at actually tracking down isolated cases of COVID-19. But there is a balancing act. I mean, they use far-reaching technology, and of course, if you try to see how a person actually is moving in its society, you give away certain privacy rights, and actually you interfering with the privacy of this person. In this particular case, it was also linked to the fueling of homophobia, because if you do contact research, if you try to trace back where a person went, you can actually see all of a person's features, identity. And this is very worrying and concern, which I hope during this seminar and also during the webinar or the conference which is coming up, that we always think about short-term decision-making with long-term effects for the wider community. So these are a few of the headlines from the past. Another example, which is even before COVID, which shows how far-reaching effects data sharing can have. Just a lesbian couple wanted to have a wedding cake, ordered a wedding cake, and the bakery said, no, because you're lesbians, I won't be baking your cake. And actually, the bakery put the contact details of these two women on the internet, and well, they've been receiving death threats ever since. So just small and large scale examples of how we should always be aware of that data, and the new technologies have positive aspect, but also worrying concerns. And that's something I would like to talk with you about today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective on that. So I mentioned already, privacy used to be a very personal, one-dimensional, single usage, legal perspective. So I have my personal data, I'm going to give it to this organization who is requesting it, and they use it, and that's end of discussion. Of course, in the digital world, in the digital society, as we all are part of, privacy has now a far-reaching, multi-dimensional and multi-usage and perspective. And I'm particularly focusing on the ethical perspective of the usage of data. It's not only me giving my personal data knowingly or unknowingly to a certain company, it's actually governments deciding on large-scale quantities of data, which gives my profile away. So I think we should move on from only what is allowed to what do we want with the way we use data. And Danny has already mentioned artificial intelligence and ethics. And that's something I hope everybody, all of our students, all professionals are to more or less extent aware of. So this should have a very different discussion. So not about the legal aspects, not the one-time use of data, but the possibilities of large-scale using of data and the morality of that. So just an example, most of you might have heard about this. This was actually an experiment on Stanford University where scientists were working on an app which could actually scan whether a person has a high likability of being gay or not. And they made some categories. And of course, there's much to say about the ethical aspect of this type of research. But the fact is that we have many countries who are actually trying to work on scans by using all sorts of personal data, trying to, well, have a personal or have apps where you can actually trace whether a person is gay, whether a person has some sort of ethnic background. So all very sensitive issues which can backfire if you do not are cautious enough. And we should be aware that, well, these experiments are going on, and that there are actually countries, companies who would like to have this technology in place. So with this wave of new technologies, there are sensors embedded in physical products. We've seen that with COVID-19 as well, actually tracing temperature, tracing the logistics, tracing the height of persons, the number of partners they have. Well, we gather the data the entire day. We all leave our data source, and it's all tracing back to individuals. Well, of course, some of you who are here today know a lot about machine learning and deep learning. The fact is that we have this digital society at all levels, and it's not only micro leveling, me giving away my data, it's large scale decision making based on the cross-border use of data. So we should be aware of the large-scale impact, the fact that it happens at all levels. And this enabling technology has the potential to, well, transform how we work, how we stay healthy, how we travel, and also tackling the global challenges like COVID is. And of course, if you think about privacy, it used to be a matter of who has the right to ask for data. Am I allowed to not give my data? But we should be aware that in the digital society, the case of privacy violations, I mean, the newspaper report on it on a daily basis, even before the COVID era. And there are various ways we can look at responsibilities, from intentional omission to gross negligence. So we are aware of these countries trying to use apps with all risks involved, and possibly, although we would like to see differently, bad intentions, scanning for certain categories of people like LGBT+, or we've seen in some countries where some, in terms of race, people were scanned and were not allowed to go to certain shops. So that's bad intention of using data, but that's a concern for sure. But we are pretty much aware of this kind of misuse, abuse of data. But I'm also aware of the willful blindness and the unintentional dumbness, as you might say, different categories of guilt. Danny described already how we are all working with data. As you are here today, you probably work with data yourself as a professional, but you use data as a person, and we all have different roles. Most of us here today have professions, so we work with data, have different responsibilities in terms of working and using this data. And we are all wheels in a system of data usage, and that's something we should be aware of. And up till now, even in the international privacy regulation, we always considered that the responsibilities in terms of privacy and data usage were very isolated, that I knew what was my responsibility. I was actually collecting it as a call center customer care employee, or whether I was the CEO, I have the end responsibility. But they're all wheels within an organization who work with data, who interpreted the data, who share data, or having to store data. And this is actually the concern I have in terms now with the new pandemic and the way data is collected. So is everybody aware that they actually are a wheel in this big system of data usage? And are you aware that there are red flags or there are concerns? There are so many examples of technology which was inappropriately using data or for different goals than it was supposed to be. How do you work with that in the future? And are you aware of your responsibilities? So willful blindness is a concept which has been used in US law as well for those who have at a certain point worked within companies and feel that there is something going wrong, or I have an intuition and I'm concerned about this. Well, speak out and discuss this, because only then the system approach becomes actually in place. So this is something we should be aware of, in particular because the way we use data, it has far-reaching consequences and it's difficult to repair. The headlines which I put in my presentation actually show the far-reaching implications of data. If dating apps, for example, one of the positive possibilities of data and technology for our community, if data is out in the open, what does this mean in terms of health and security issues for the individuals who were on these dating apps? And this type of concerns, we should always be aware of that whenever we think about new technologies and what it means in terms of our own responsibility. So speak out when you have concerns. With the GDPR, so the privacy law in the EU, but also in general, national privacy law, you can see different roles and responsibilities being incorporated. There are provisions on what is my responsibility when I collect data, who is responsible for storage, when does a person have the right to be forgotten, and when does data need to be destructed. So it appears as if it's a very clear organization with clear responsibilities of who is in charge of what way of using the data. And in a perfect world, this would be the ideal situation, a very black and white thinking in terms of responsibility. But as we know in the digital society, data can become big data, data can be shared, data can be, even if it's used anonymously, it can become a sort of personas or profiles or stereotyping. So using data with new possibilities coming up, we know what we can do with the technology today, but the data we collect today, what can be done with it from a technology point of perspective in the coming years? So that requires a collective responsibility. And that's something we as human beings find difficult. We all do. That's also the thing which we now confronted with in the COVID situation, that we are collectively responsible for something abstract, privacy, a wicked problem. So I'm calling in for more collective responsibility, and of course you need to translate it into your own individual way of doing things, but be aware that you are just a wheel in a larger system. And it brings me to the decision making in times of pandemic. And once again, if you have questions, please share them on the chat function. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and remarks. I would actually like to suggest that COVID-19, as we are all confronted with today, and privacy are both wicked problems. They are examples of complex systems. Complex systems has certain features that the future is unknown, and the total is more than the sum of its parts. And we have an issue as human beings to having to respond to such a wicked problem as it becomes imminent. But of course, with every complex problem, you need to have this long-term integrated or holistic view actually to understand what was going on. So at COVID-19, we've seen the discussion whether it was the Chinese markets, which actually that's where it started. So blame the Chinese market, but then scientists already discovered that there are very much more factors in place, like climate change, like geopolitics, and well, you probably watched it all on the news. And the same is to be said about privacy. Like I mentioned, it's not a one legal dimensional issue. Privacy is about what we do today, what can we do with the data later on, who is responsible for that, and more importantly, they all concern issues of health, security, the economy, and privacy. And in terms of decision making, you can see that these values, like health, security, economy, and privacy, are being used to explain why we do what we do and why we need this data. But in itself, these values can be interpreted in many ways. So using a tracking app or transport app to know where a person has been during COVID times, of course, it's an idea of isolating cases and trying to prevent a further lockdown, but it might have a security issue for the person whose data is being registered, like I mentioned with the Seoul case. So that's something we should always be aware of, that these are multi-interpretable. So what I'm actually trying to say here is that COVID-19 and privacy are both complex systems. So our way of thinking often is traditional thinking, is causal relation. A leads to B. I'm doing this to prevent that, or this is caused by that. And actually, privacy in itself, data and ethics, like COVID-19, it's a complex system. So every elements are all interdependent and reacting on one another. So what we try to do now, with also in this conference in November, is trying to look at what do we see and what are the mechanisms when we talk about data, and what are the responsibilities. So what wheel can we actually put into place to make sure that the whole system is moving in an ethical direction, so that it's beneficial to all of us. And again, this requires a collective response and a system discussion. So to wrap up, the misunderstanding about privacy is that it's a private interest. That's old-fashioned way of thinking. People react at first when there was an introduction of cameras in cities to make our cities more safe. Everybody responded by saying, I have nothing to hide. It's for the good cause. I have nothing to hide. So if I'm being recorded on camera, I don't mind. I trust my government and the data are protected. And even if I could be seen on it, they blur my eyes or they would not put my name in there. But this is not this old way of looking at data. So this is not the way we should think. And if we think about technology, we should have another discussion. So data-based governance, that's actually what we're talking about today. It's not about a personal, private interest. It's our data being used in such a way that our governments, our companies, all actors in society are making decisions based on this data. So privacy is of a general interest. It should be interpreted as that. So what we are likely going to see, that COVID-19 pandemic, as it will be here with us for well, at least a couple of more years, it will speed up the phenomenon of this data-based governance. And this will have far-reaching implications for our democracy and the rule of law. So our human rights. It will be the basis, data. So hopefully it's trustworthy, first of all, and not unreliable. And we've seen a lot of examples of that as well, and biases and well, even the bias in algorithms. That it will be the base for policy design. And how do we actually work as you are here today as professionals? We use this technology, we use this data, but how do we make sure that we continue to have our critical attitudes toward what the data is presenting? I mean, data is great, it's a big value, and I think Danny will talk about that some more. But always to be aware that we as a human being are not only following the data and following the computer. So it can be a threat if we are not cautious enough. So, for example, the prohibition to discriminate or the right to fair trial. So I'm going to speed up so I have enough time for your talks with you. Wrap up. We are all a small part in a complex system, both as a professional, as a human being. We all decide, work, or leave a data trace on a day-to-day basis. So that's something we should be aware of. And I'm going to wrap up with trying to think about some very easy skills which we can all incorporate and practice on a day-to-day basis to make sure that we are not going back to the old-fashioned way of looking at privacy. So from a resilient democracy point of view, that's of course ethics by design. So in the technology, the way we use it, the ethical dimensions, in addition to legal dimensions, should be incorporated. So first of all, we all have our own biases, and that's something we should just recognize and speak out. We as human beings, we are, concluding based on what we've seen, what we've heard, what we've observed, what we've experienced, and that's where our biases come from. So first of all, and I'm using the thinking cap picture, take time to reflect. Too often also with my students, we tend to react right away. We have an opinion, we think about something, but of course try to work hard, use your brains. It's so self-explanatory, but nevertheless we tend to be reacting too fast. So recognize your own cognitive bias. So where is your bias? Can you actually put it in words? Why are you thinking this way? And what is your intuition or feeling? Or in emergency situations, of course, we have this system one, which need to react right away based on adrenaline. But in terms of the largest, like pandemic now, we have to act sort of an emergency situation. But nevertheless, we also know that there's far-reaching effects of what we decide on today. So we need to train our logical and rational reasoning. Of course, you need to do that not on your own, by having discussions. The second skill, which can be used when we try to put our system work into practice. With everything you do, be aware of the defining moment. So that's the big worry in terms of technology in COVID times, that because we feel there's such an urgency, there's stress, there's all our sort of safeguards have fallen away, especially in the heat of COVID a couple of weeks ago. So we feel there's stress, we feel insecure, we are limited in that way to think critically, because we want to have it solved now. We want to be sure that there is a positive scenario on the way, but be aware that this stress is limiting our decision-making capacity. And sometimes you just need to prepare and make a list or pause for a time. And we actually seen some of the politicians do that, actually saying, we are not aware now, we have to get back to that, we have to deep dive into this. And I think a good politician should act that way. And very important, recognize the importance of its events, because we are all wheels in a big system, that we are aware that even if it seems small, your yes or no, or by using a certain word, actually can have a far-reaching impact on the entire system. So this is something I would like to have all those tech people who are actually working on apps and screening materials and screening instruments to to be aware of how this data, and I mean, Cambridge Analytica was an example of that as well. It was a beautiful tool, but are you aware who's going to use it for what purpose, and that it's actually a defining moment in this time. The third skill, of course, distinguish fact from assumption, and that's also the A to B example which I've given, a causal link. Our brain is full of assumptions, in addition to biases. So what is real proof which supports your reasoning, and what are assumptions? And maybe you can test your assumptions instead of just presenting them as facts. Look for hard evidence, and that's always what we ask our students to do. So reliable hard evidence. The last skills, and all these skills, they should be integrated, and then you have a sort of systemic start of how to act and how to make up your decision making. You probably noticed this image from the elephant. It's depending on which perspective you are at, where are you located, what do you see? And we are all, again, part of the country where we're based, whether or not part of the community, the language we speak, the profession we have, the age we have. I mean, that also, rich is a rich perspective or limited perspective. So too often I see professionals having a tunnel vision. So please be aware, and again, I think this is something for the LGBTQ+ community, that we are actually an advocacy, that we show that this is of a higher risk to technology, which is now presented of the community. So I guess people who are not part of the community, of course, they have a different perspective. They do not feel the same as being part of the community. So how can we make sure that the ones who decide, the ones who make the tools, actually take this LGBTQ+ community perspective into consideration? And therefore, we need to have invitations sending out for discussions. Thinking long-term and short-term is particularly important in terms of crisis. Can you actually pinpoint, as a decision-making or as one of the other wheels in the system, the impacts of acting, non-acting, short-term and long-term? Too often, the long-term vision is being forgotten. It's only when we look back and we think, what just happened? Why were we blind in that sense? Why didn't we see this coming? And there's various examples, especially I know from the EU, beautiful decision making, but somehow we missed the point of how the times would change, and how what was invented at the time would backfire at us, all of us, in the long term. And of course, expect the unexpected. And so are you aware of emergency situation, and what do you have in place to counter those? So and the last question, and that's something I hope you all, but also students will never fail to do, is ask questions. I think we should aim for a society where asking questions is normal again. Too often, people within organizations are considered to be too critical or pessimistic, or even considered whistleblowers if they pinpoint at the why. But I think this is something we should start as a movement, just to ask in a good way, why are we doing this? Why is this the best way? Why are we inviting people's view in terms of consultation? So I'm challenging everybody to be that 4-year-old again who asks 437 questions every day, and to also the other party to welcome this sort of question, because this helps you with the logical way of thinking. So basically, guys, this is a short, teaser, as in using the words of Danny, to think about technology and data in terms of crisis, and what are the ethical dimensions, and what does it mean for all of us in our different professional roles. So thank you all for watching, listening, and I've seen with my right eye some of the great questions coming up. So hopefully we can now Danny and I can respond to that. So thank you all. Well, I think in general, if we look at surveys, it's important way, especially for us as scientists, also to collect data and self-disclosure. Well, I have some good and some negative experiences with that. I think in general, the ones who's asking the questions, sending out the survey, it's of course the informed consent, which you should be aware of. And too often we see that it's quite limited the way it's being phrased. So it still pretends to be a one-time use way of data. And I think we should have a more explanation where we can actually say this data can be used for so and so many reasons. And well, self-disclosure, maybe is the one who's asking the question can give an example with what is meant by this.
I think also he's looking at as with the presentation, and you've gone to look to the future with privacy issues. He's thinking about the reference to that as far as employee surveys as they are now, quite unidimensional.
Yeah.
Going into the future and where that might open up into more complexity and how that might affect privacy.
Yeah, well, in general, if I do not want to sound too negative, but I see organizations often not aware that this employee surveys, that there is very personal data being used, and that this is used for policy making, and this is used for HR or staff policies, and that actually this has far-reaching consequences. So. More a general way of responding is that I would like to see that if we use these surveys, if we use the way of self-disclosure, I would like to see a discussion within an organization on what are we in terms of data management. And like I mentioned, even 2 years ago, I saw many organizations having a very isolated task responsibilities in terms of how privacy should be protected within their organization. And I did not see any fundamental discussions within organizations on why are we using this data? Why are we steering? Why is our governance structure based on this data? And are we all responsible for that? So this aspect, what I try to present on terms of collective responsibility, I guess that's something which I have not seen in reality as much as I would like to see. Even with larger firms, it's a compliance officer, it's a privacy officer, very fragmented responsibilities. And if you think about self-disclosure or surveys, I think we should, as organizations, have a general discussion. And this is just one element within this broader discussion.
Okay. Danny, would you like to speak to that at all? In the chat, there were people were clarifying that disclosure is sexual orientation, identifying as gay, lesbian, trans, bi, intersex, etc. Would you like to speak to that at all?
Well, I also saw in the chat that the question was also about benefits, right? So
yes.
Maybe also thinking of certain benefits. So I'm a manager, people manager, and so for what I would like with that kind of information is also to make sure that people are promoted and not be discriminated because of some certain factors, if it's the sexuality, if it's the ethnicity. So I think just from that HR perspective, to also kind of keep track that enough people are promoted from all different minorities. I think that's a very important point, and also seeing at the career development to help them with their career.
Wonderful, thank you. And on to another question from Martin or Martijn. You mentioned that data can be used for bad reasons, though how and who decides what those reasons are? Yeah. Would you like to
Shall I respond? Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
please.
So that's the discussion. What is a good cause? What's a bad cause? Too often we see that we think we agree on what is a good cause, and actually it backfires, and it can be used for bad causes. And also the perspective, what I consider to be a good cause can vary from what another person sees as a good cause. So indeed, I mean, that's the whole aspect of the self-disclosure as well. Do you think that disclosing it will give you extra reasons as an organization to help people to make sure that the emancipation goes on and that they're equal rights? Or is it a way of being singled out? Good cause, bad cause, like the other values, are not absolute terms. But in my mind, I think the discussion is to be taking place. And what we now see is that there's a lot of policies being made, but not with all stakeholders. So we should invite all stakeholders and use their perspective, like I tried to address with the image of the elephant, to get some kind of feeling of what is a good cause. But even good causes change over time. There are many examples from climate change perspective where we thought we were doing the right thing, and then all of a sudden scientific insights changed, and it turned out that we were doing the wrong thing. So having discussions is very important, and in these terms with the community for the stakeholders' perspective. So how is everything perceived? And too often, those who are the decision makers, whether it's a country level or organization level, think they know what the LGBT community perspective is, and I think that you can never pretend that you know the perspective if you do not have them on board. So that's why I'm very happy with this organization. Actually, so many organizations have people who are actively promoting and doing advocacy within their organization to make sure that the perspective is being heard. So yeah, good cause, bad cause, that's something I hope we have more discussions about.
No, I completely agree. And also from a more tech perspective. So I think every kind of technology always has a good side and a bad side, and you always have to kind of weigh both sides to see, is it worth implementing a solution? And then I really like that elephant picture, to really, like when we implement a solution, or even before implementing a solution, we do design thinking sessions to actually involve all the different stakeholders and also the end users of that solution, to really make sure that all different perspectives are heard and also well taken care of, and in the final implementation.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Next is a challenging one from Susan. Is specifically mentioning slide 13. So maybe we can go back to slide 13.
Well, what I try to challenge myself, of course, first of all, but also students and all of you who are here today, is to understand how we make our decisions on a day-to-day basis. And what I touched upon in my presentation was the aspect of willful blindness that is in the US law has been incorporated as a form of guilt. Which is a new form of guilt, which has had far-reaching impact on responsibilities. And willful blindness, actually, like I described, is with large-scale fiascos or emergency situations taking place. Often, looking back, you think, how could this actually take place? How could this emerge? And there were some signal poles, some red flags, which we did notice as human beings, but we did not act upon that. So that's what we call willful blindness. So we chose not to look or deep dive or discover or search for what is going on. So that makes us ethically blind, and therefore there's some guilt. And in terms of skills, the bias, I said, well, we all have our own bias. So if we have to decide on data, the quality of data, the richness of data, the possibilities, whether data is used for the good or for the bad cause, we should be aware that we have a certain bias. And towards others, towards ourselves, towards the quality of data. So that's what I meant. And I try to elaborate on also that we have assumptions, that we do not think the systemic, that we use causal thinking. So all examples from my side, just a few brief ones to make sure that we, on everything we do, are aware that we are just a human being with a certain psychology, that we act immediately with our own biases, with assumption, with causal rationale.
Thank you. Sorry about that. A quick positive feedback point from Cecile, who says it's very important to accept we all have our biases, and it reflects to just what you just said.
Yeah.
And taking the time to reflect on that is very important, says Cecile. On to our next question from Pedro. Data privacy and security concerns are often cited as reasons why not to introduce self-ID / disclosure in internal companies, for example, HR systems. Are these valid concerns or reasons?
Yeah, probably is again.
Yeah.
I mean, depending for where you're based, what type of country. I'm again stressing that I see whether or not to incorporate self-disclosure. I think I would like to see it as a broader discussion of how we deal with our data and why do we ask this data. I mean, it's the same question many parents get to when they have a child. They ask what is your highest level of education, and particularly school reports, school successes are being based on whether children meet the level of intelligence and study as the parents did. So that's also, is that a good cause? Is that a bad cause? Is that something which is also being biased? I mean, again, I think we as a society should have a fundamental discussion of data, and it's an ongoing process. So what we think now is the wise thing to do, to whether or not to self-disclose. I think in general that the privacy law as we have it today is too limited. I mean, the questions we get from larger companies as a research group, it's often that they have their GDPR standards in place, but nevertheless they work with a certain thing, a customer journey project, and now all of a sudden ethical aspects come into place. So legally it's okay, but they wonder, is this the right direction? Is this in terms with our corporate social responsibility? How is the society looking at us in 2 years' time? So that fundamental question should be on the agenda. And like I mentioned, it's now a too isolated issue. So you can only answer yes or no to this question when you think about the ethical aspects and when you think that it's a shared view from the company, and that the company is aware of changing norms in society and the impact it can have on individual members and staff.
Thank you so much. Danny, if you could handle the second half of Pedro's question, I'd appreciate it. And with that is, how can we balance these short-term fears with the long-term benefits of supporting LGBT staff enabled by insights driven from such data in the first place?
Yeah, I think it ties in with what I mentioned earlier, with like some sort of career development. But I think one really important aspect is also transparency, right? As Willeke said, so really making sure, why are you collecting the data? What do you want to do with that data, and to what end? And yeah, I was also thinking about retention and like data destruction, like all those things. So I think that the first step to really take care of those short-term fears is really being transparent. Why do you want that data? What do you want to do with that data? And also highlighting the benefits for each individual, being career development, being support, being offering more targeted training material, or those kind of things.
Okay, wonderful. Just one more quick point before I think we finish up. In the chat, Marine's speaking to another example of data is the ownership of data, or a facet of that. And companies like Google or Facebook think that they have ownership, while others are clear that the data belongs to the individual users. Would you like to both speak to that briefly?
Yeah, a very good point, and thank you again for all these great questions which were sent in. Indeed, ownership. The initial idea is that the data is mine, and of course, I also have the right to be forgotten, and there's a lot of jurisprudence on that aspect. So I think data as the new gold. A lot of companies consider it to be their data. So this is a wrong way of interpreting, especially if it does not go inside with the larger scale of the responsibility. So ownership without responsibility, that's too often what I see. Indeed, that the data should belong to an individual. But of course, if data is collected on a large scale, it becomes big data, statistical data, artificial intelligence. Who's the owner of that? But probably Danny knows more about that.
Well, I think it's a very difficult question, right? Like, who, as you said, so who is the owner of the data? So I think to a very high degree, it should be you. Like you as a person. I mean, it's your data. So you have to, in the end, as a final step, you have to be able to make the decision you want the data to be kept or not. So I think that's like very important, that even if like some company owns the data, that you always have that veto if you don't want the data to be kept, to be used, that you can always make sure that it gets forgotten.
And thank you also from my side to Willeke and Danny. Very thought-provoking webinar, and to be honest, it's a little bit scary to me sometimes to hear some of the things that we have to think about for the future, but it's very pertinent for this moment, particularly with the pandemic going around. And I really do look forward to the event on the 13th of November, Tech WorkplacePride in Groningen. There's always a rainbow in the clouds, so that will be the follow-up to this in even more detail. So to everybody else, I'd like to also again thank you for tuning into this webinar. Now the webinar, as you know, we have every week. So the webinar next week is entitled "I'm a New Me," and this will be all about the transgender topic, so transitioning in the workplace. And again, within the framework of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it'll be quite thought-provoking. That will be on June 3rd, so next Wednesday at 1 o'clock. And so I do hope you'll be able to tune in. Also, just go to workplacepride.org//online, and you'll find all the information. So thanks to everyone again for tuning in, and hope to see you next week.